it's a dream come true that we can actually see what's really going on, what really drives our decisions. I find that endlessly fascinating as a window into our non-consciousness that has remained elusive for, all of human life, right? Thousands of years. Daniel Kahneman received the Nobel Prize in 1992. He would show that rational decision-making doesn't really exist. We are all biased in some way or another. I think it's fair to say that it's truly our emotions that drive all of our decision-making. So neuroeconomics is about money, time, and emotions. The brain seems to very much be hardwired for loss aversion, that losses hurts twice as much as gains do good. And of course, that's why it becomes very relevant when investing, because imagine that you constantly monitor the value of your stocks. Even though you may actually make money in the end, which you should do, you could actually feel worse about it. I know that the goal of investing is to make money, but the goal should also be to feel better and not feel worse. It's not only bad to do extravagant spending. The cafe latte rule, it's basically taking those small everyday expenses that doesn't really provide us much well-being, right? And just investing them. There are many studies suggesting that when you become very rich, you don't become happier. AI in general in decision-making is very, very, very fascinating to me, how we sort of outsource our decision-making to AI.
Your brain, emotions, and attention are sabotaging your money decisions. That irrational spending, like shopping therapy or revenge spending after a bad week, or any impulsive investing now with the fear of missing out on AI, Tesla, crypto. After the news we've read, right? Doom scrolling on stock apps and financial apps all day long. All these money leaks that could be invested. And tying your identity to net worth or luxury, that can be very dangerous, right? These moments are proof that it's somehow outdated to believe that you can always spend money or invest logically without your emotions and attention taking over some of your decisions. This episode, I will talk to neuroeconomist Jon Wegener to analyze these bad money habits and what's really happening in our brain during these moments when emotion and attention, not logic, hijack our actions. Break some myths and misconceptions about money behaviors and potentially transform them into something that can be an asset backed by science. Jon will show you how to use these small emotional expenses as fuel for investing, drawing from his research on neuroeconomics and also his book, Le Café Latte Rule. Jon is a brain researcher specializing in neuroeconomics. He is an external lecturer at the Copenhagen Business School in Denmark and also a co-author of the book, Le Café Latte Rule. Jon, thanks for being here.
It's a pleasure.
Tell me about yourself. What got you into neuroeconomics?
I think I was, as a young student, I was very much interested in why we humans are as we are, and got the idea that we don't really control who we are. It's something non-conscious that actually makes the decisions for us. There was a billion studies back then suggesting that when we think we made a decision, our brain has already made that decision that we think our consciousness has made. So for me, it was obvious to study the human brain, because it's sort of where psychology and decision-making meets biology. So the idea was to study the actual substrate, the material that really makes the decisions for us, right? It's in a way a study our non-consciousness. So that's why I got interested in the brain and in brain scanning technology and using that to look into the healthy human brain while we make economic decisions.
And how is that different to other economic theories like the rational investor or rational consumer?
Yes, I can imagine that most of the people watching this or listening to this knows about Daniel Kahneman and behavioral economics, right? He received the Nobel Prize in 1992. He was a psychologist. And as you know, psychologists, they don't have a Nobel Prize, so he received the Nobel Prize in economics. He was the first prominent researcher to really study how we actually make decisions, right? He would show that rational decision making doesn't really exist. We are all biased in some way or another. And so the logical next step that he couldn't take because the technology wasn't there is to take these ideas and these experiments that he made, behavioral experiments, and simply take them into the scanner to look at the brain and see how does the brain actually make those so-called irrational decisions or biased decisions. So that's the whole idea of neuroeconomics. It's basically taking behavioral economics and in some extent experimental economics and simply upgrading what they've been doing to the era of brain science and scanning technology.
So this has applications to us, minimal spending, investing, right?
Yes.
Social progress, wellness, even education. So before I go more into that, I want to ask you what you teach at CBS.
Yes, I've been teaching this graduate elective at CBS in neuroeconomics for about, I think, 16 years. And the idea is to teach the students basically how we actually do make decisions and how our brain and body makes those decisions for us. So simply getting an insight into our non-consciousness that actually drives all of these decisions way before our consciousness can kick in and try to rationalize our behavior. So the idea is to know about all the emotions that actually control us. I mean, obviously, our language may not be updated to the era of brain science, but in lack of better word, I think it's fair to say that it's truly our emotions that drive all of our decision making. And in a way, when we study the brain and how it's involved in decision making, we're basically studying the intricacies of our emotions, how they actually gives rise to or correlate with brain activity way before we actually think we've made the decision, right? So I think I find that endlessly fascinating as a window into our non-consciousness that has remained elusive for, I mean, all of human life, right? Thousands of years. It's a dream come true that we can actually see what's really going on, what really drives our decisions. So that's what fascinates me about the subject. So neuroeconomics is basically also, of course, it's about money as classical economics, and it's easy to use money in experiments, right? Because it's so easily quantifiable, but it's also about time, right? Time is also a resource apart from money, and emotions is certainly also a limited resource, even though, I mean, to be alive is to be, driven by emotions. I mean, even when we sleep, our emotions are always active. So it's easy to see that being alive is being emotional, and also reverse the causality, and being emotional is being alive. You just cannot be alive without having emotions. So studying that is, for me, endlessly fascinating, how we allocate resources and how not only money and time, but also emotions as a resource. And that's a central aspect of the book, that we have to keep all of these three kinds of resources in mind when figuring out what to do when we invest, right? Because it does cost money, and you can also make money, obviously, when you invest. It definitely costs time. We cannot avoid that, right? That's also a limited resource. We're gonna die someday. We can use our time for something else, and it also has an emotional impact, right? And in that way, I think the most well-known bias is loss aversion, part of Daniel Kahneman's prospect theory, and where it's so well documented, not only humans, but also in animals, that if I give you, 1,000 euros, right, you'll feel good about it. But if I steal 1,000 euros from you, if you lose 1,000 euros, it feels about twice as bad to lose those 1,000 euros as it feels good to get those 1,000 euros. And of course, that's why it becomes very relevant when investing, because when we see our portfolio, the value of our stocks go down, right, it hurts twice as much as it feels good when we see the value go up. So imagine that you constantly monitor the value of your stocks or the value of your portfolio, and even though you may actually make money in the end, which you should do, you could actually feel worse about it, right? Because if you constantly monitor this and every time it goes down, it feels twice as bad and when it goes up. I mean, you can end up miserable, even though you're making money, because also you can constantly see what you could have been making, because you can never make optimal decisions. You can never sell at the exact highest point. You can never buy at the exact lowest point. So there's this constant feeling of loss and regret, which is, I think, is at least important for me to really take that seriously. I know that the goal of investing is to make money, but the goal of investing should also be to feel better and not feel worse.
Exactly. Before I go into that a little bit more on what you are working on, you have your own research consultancy, right?
Yes.
Are you also working with individuals, working with organizations in these areas?
Yes, when I work with individuals, it's usually about monitoring their physiology with very primitive devices. Obviously, people can't walk around with a brain scanner, but
Mhm.
primitive devices like Garmin, for
Okay.
example, just wearing a Garmin watch 24/7 and monitoring how this, especially the stress response, because you can monitor also with Apple and so
Mhm.
many devices, but I just prefer Garmin because it knows the ecosystem the best, that you can actually monitor 24/7 the stress response. How stressed are people? A very good
Mhm.
measurement of emotional resource, how emotional resources are spent. So that's what I do. Usually I measure them for a few months and then I make them record what they're doing with their time. Usually we
Uh-huh.
just synchronize it with their calendar and so on, and even who they're talking to. How it's basically how they spend their time, how they invest, when they do it, and then monitor their stress response and sleep and so on at the same time, with the sole goal of improving well-being.
Okay.
So I see making money and investing as a potential tool for well-being. So whereas other people may just have the goal of just making money, I have the goal of increasing well-being. That's sort of my gold standard, right? I want to increase happiness or the quality of life. So yeah, so that's what I do for individuals.
That's interesting because I recently read a study that wealthy people also have this deception that might not necessarily feel happy. So that they would also make more, right?
Certainly, certainly. I mean, there are many studies suggesting that when you become very rich, you don't become happier, right? It's sort of the consensus is that it's upper middle class. Once you've reached upper middle class,
Mhm.
you have money enough to go on vacation, maybe have a summer house, and you can take care of your kids' education, and so on. And you have one or two cars. You just don't get happier than that. You can get a lot richer, but so the idea is also that the richer you get, the more you have to lose.
Uh,
So
yeah,
again, this
that's what you
loss
mentioned.
aversion,
Yes.
so central to human behavior. So you can even watch it in the brain. There's an area in the brain called the striatum, and it's sort of it helps tracking value. And you can even watch that, and it's associated with well-being, the
Mhm.
striatum, and you can even see that. Yeah, if I give you those €1,000, we can see an increase in activity in striatum. But again, if I take away those €1,000, the activity lowers about twice as much as it would go up with €1,000. So again, the brain seems to very much be hardwired for this kind of loss aversion that we talked about, right? That losses hurts twice as much as gains does us good or do good, right?
And is that evolutionary? Does it come from hardwiring to avoid danger, etc.?
Exactly, because we see it in animals as well. So it's completely a universal bias in a way that you call it bias in animal behavior as well. So it's very, very old. And exactly as you indicate, it has something to do with it's more important to avoid getting killed or avoid bodily harm than it is to, get sex or get something good
Mhm.
to eat, right? So our nervous system is constantly monitoring the environment for potential threats, and potential threats always take priority over all other kinds of stimuli.
Understood. I wanted to also touch upon your book, The Cafe Latte Rule. Could you explain to us briefly what's the big idea that you're exploring?
Yes, apart from the idea that we have these three kinds of resources, money, time, and emotions, it's basically, and that's also the title, the Cafe Latte Rule. It's basically taking those small expenses, those small everyday expenses that doesn't really provide us much well-being, right? You could just buy a thermocup and bring your cafe latte from back home, or whatever else you could do. Right? So it's basically taking those small expenses and just investing them. And now I know that your listeners, well, not that many are Danish, so I won't sell you any books. So I could just tell you the secret. No,
But
so
the concept
so
is universal, right? The concept transcends languages, right?
exactly. Oh yeah, yeah. It's completely universal. The idea is, of course, saving up those money from lowering those sort of everyday expenses, and basically just putting them into an ETF that tracks one of the large indexes like SP 500,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think SP 500 is probably the best one because there's so much competition. There's so many companies having this product, this on the SP 500, which has driven the costs down. I think it's all the way down to 0.04% in
Mm-hmm.
annual expenses on having this. And basically, for me, that's sort of an open and shut game because that's how you should invest,
Mm-hmm.
right? And not only are you maximizing in the long run the money coming from this, there's no better investment than this in the long run. And you don't have to spend a lot of time because you just have to buy once. Or if you do these kinds of savings, you can just allocate it automatically.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever you save on those cafe lattes and other kinds of small expenses, just put them in and invest them in the same index. It could be some other index. It's just SP 500 is the cheapest and probably the best. And again, the emotional impact of doing this is extremely low, right? So
Indeed.
because even though I won't suggest you do it, but even if you constantly monitor how it's going with your SP 500 ETF, there's not a lot of volatility, right? Because it's the 500 biggest American companies at all times. So it means that it goes up and down, very little day to day. So there's not a lot of emotional impact. You won't feel this loss aversion very much, right? It's just constantly over time getting a little bit higher on average. And I think for most people, that's just the best way to invest. It's as boring as that.
Boring and repetitive, right? That could build wealth with compounding.
Exactly. Exactly. That kind of controls sort of some of this behavior that kicks in when we invest in other ways, right? When we invest in single stocks, especially smaller companies, but also larger companies. But just investing in single stocks, it really takes you on that roller coaster that can actually, in the end, make you more miserable. Of course, it will make you miserable if you lose money, but it may even make you miserable, even if you're making money, because you constantly feel these losses, right? Because you check it maybe every day or maybe a few times a day, and you will see that some of your single stocks will go down significantly once in a while, and that would really hurt you, right?
Mhm.
So that's why it's sort of a way to circumvent all of this and just put it in that index, right? But of course, for a lot of people, this will be too boring. It's even too boring for me. I can't follow that advice myself, right? But ideally, that's what you should do, and then spend your time doing something else.
Exactly. So you're saying that the money that I would already consider lost or stop valuing them emotionally, like money on coffee, is perfect for investing. Now, what about yourself? Do you also find yourself doing that? Or can you tell me about like one time where you've actually been tricked and you had that emotion, that impulse spending?
Oh yeah, many times. The thing is, just after I wrote the book in 2024, I actually did put all my money in an SP 500 ETF. But
So you put
then,
your money where your mouth is, right? Exactly.
Yes, exactly. But then as time went on, right, and I kept on checking how it's going. I got tempted, right? I
Mm.
got tempted to buy single stocks, right? So because I mean it's more fun. What's also sort of exciting about buying single stocks, it is of course the increased volatility,
Mhm.
right? It's the risk. I'm very interested in sex differences in investing as well, and
Okay.
the male brain just loves risk more than the female brain. So of course it's just fun to run risks, right? I mean, if you're with a friend and you look this, rock paper scissors whenever you have to do something. Who goes to the store or who goes and buys food and so on? Rock paper. It just makes it more fun. We just like risk, right? So of course I'm only human, so I'm prone to wanting to run risks. So that's why I've sold more and more of my SP 500. I still have some left, but I've sold more and more to buy single stocks, right? Because I make the stupid mistake of thinking that I know something that the market doesn't, right? And it's a mistake I make over and over again, but it's only human, right? It is just human. And yeah, the brain is actually doing exactly what it's evolved to do, but
Mm.
just in the wrong environment, right?
Okay.
A very modern environment, right? The stock exchanges doesn't exist in evolutionary time. So in that way, our brain is not adapted at all for this environment, and mine neither.
It's, yes, as you mentioned, way more difficult. And by the way, I'm guilty too. I've done the same things. I found also very hard to deal with the fact that I was investing in with a mobile app where you have constant access to your portfolio. You constantly hear about the spike on Tesla, Nvidia. You start feeling you're missing out on the upside, etc. That part of using the mobile app or any type of financial tool that on the one hand gives you a lot of information, etc., even though I'm not a day trader. And until I got out of that ecosystem, I was really stressed, and that even made me do impulse investing. So
Yes.
can you explain to me what's happening in our brain when we actually like constantly do this checking? And also I know you have some measures that you can solve it.
Yeah, but basically you're indicating exactly what you should do. It's just delete those apps, right? Avoid financial news. And also remember the bank or whomever you do in the investing through, of course, has a very keen interest in making those transaction cost money. So they'll
Mhm.
do everything they can in order to get you to buy and sell because that's their business model. So they have every incentive to do that. I know there's even some EU regulation where they have to actually contact you. I think it's once every half year to sort of ask you to check your portfolio. And of course, they
Okay.
really take advantage of that as well. They'll make every excuse to contact you, to feed you news, free premium news, whatever they can do for them, of course, to make you buy and sell. Right? I mean, that's what they basically live on. That's transaction costs, right? And the casino always wins, right? In that way, it's like a casino. So you're right. Whenever we consume news, financial news, it also constantly feeds this fear of missing out. It constantly feeds the idea that that maybe we know something that the market hasn't priced in yet, right? It gives us this illusion. You could call it illusion of knowledge, or that we actually know something that the rest of the world doesn't, right? And when you say it, it's obvious that it's wrong, but this again, it's emotions, it's feelings, and they do whatever they want with our decision making, right? So that's why it's so important uh, to be more in control of what kind of information, where you place your attention, right?
Sure.
Because it will it will change our decision making, how we sort of allocate our attention. So, that's a difficult one because when you're interested in something and you are invested in something, it feels natural. You have an urge to see how's it going? How's it going with my investment? Like you want to know how it's going with your children if you have any children, right? It's obvious whatever you feel some responsibility for, or you feel that you own in a way, that you
Mm.
really want to know what's going on. So again, it's this sort of old brain that is just not built for this modern environment.
And when you have an unexpected win, you're always tempted to risk more rather than cash in. That's probably the good thing to do. But it's this double-edged sword that, you lose, it's bad. You win, you're tempted to do more risky attempts, right?
Yes, exactly. And that's again, I mean, you could call it a result of hindsight bias, right? Because the problem is we can constantly see graphically, right? We can constantly see the history of a particular stock,
Mm-hmm.
right? And when we then have an unexpected win, we have this tendency, I had this feeling that this stock would go up,
My
right?
gut feeling, right?
We can tell ourselves, well, I am smart. I actually do know something that the rest of the market doesn't know. So it increases this, you would call it overconfidence, right?
Mm.
That we begin to build this confidence that we can actually see something in the market that other people can't, right? So that's why this unexpected win can definitely have, detrimental effects, right? Because yeah, the more overconfident we become, the more risk, exactly as you indicate, we take, and the more likely we are to lose, right?
Mhm.
So yeah,
So one solution you mentioned is getting out of this ecosystem where you have where you trade through your phone, and you could use alternative desktop or something else just to add that friction as we discussed.
yes, exactly. So I know usually friction is sort of a negative word. It's something we usually want to remove friction, but in this sense, we want to increase friction, right? We want to make it harder for us to make impulsive decisions, right? So that's why it's so smart and so obvious to remove the apps on your phone, right? Because at least, exactly to indicate, at least we have to go to our desktop, right? And
Mhm.
it could also be smart that you have separate banks for your investments and your sort of normal banking affairs, your checking account and so on, because then it will also introduce again more friction. You have to move money from one account to another. Hopefully, you're so lucky that there's a time delay,
Okay.
right? Usually, there's maybe 1 day time delay, and that's a long time in terms of reducing impulsivity, right? When you sleep on it, and then there's a high chance that you make less risky, less impulsive decisions. So anything we can do to increase that friction is good at this point.
Mm. As you said, and sometimes we make better decisions when we are calmer, getting the brain into a state that it can be more logical and weigh pros and cons, risk.
Exactly. I think the highest danger is probably having trading apps on your phone,
Mhm.
right? Also because you could be out and maybe you get a little bit drunk or whatever is happening, right? That's just a match made in hell, right? That you have constant access to your trading account, right? And it make it even worse, of course, if you allow notifications from
Mm.
that trading app, because of course they'll again do everything they can to make you trade more at any time of the day, right? It's really important to understand the incentive structure from the bank, right? What they're interested in doing and how it's not aligned with our interests. It's not a friend, right? It's a
Yes.
business that makes money on you losing money in a way.
So we've captured how attention, as you said, or over doom scrolling can deregulate our emotions, right? Instead of informing us. We think it's informing us, but it's actually deregulating us. And discuss some of the things that happen to our brain when we talk about the fear of missing out, hype, that are so related to investing, and also aversion. And we also touched upon some areas that have to do with rational investing versus uh, understanding how our emotions and attention control our money decisions. Another very interesting topic is now the rise of artificial intelligence to either enable us invest, research, right? So now people use GPT for everything. And also we have these robo investors that can structure your portfolio, right? How do you see that that trend? Do you see that as a good thing for your research that enables you? Do you see this as impacting the way you handle your emotions? I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on AI and investing.
I think that's a very interesting area. I mean, AI in general in decision making is very, very, very fascinating to me. How we sort of outsource our decision making to AI, and I think there are some pros and cons to this. If we first take the pros of doing it, first of all, if you ask any Gen AI, how should I invest my money optimally, right? If you ask it the right way, it will just say an index ETF fund, right? I mean, exactly as I mentioned earlier, that will be the answer, right? How should I invest my retirement fund and so on? I mean, it's so obvious. And in that sense, it's very good for the individual if you follow that advice. It is so smart, right? It's also good. Again, thinking about your retirement. Most retirement funds, they charge between 1% and 2% every year, right? If you could get down to 0.04% over the long run, that will make a huge difference in how much money you have for retirement. So in that sense, I think AI has the ability to really help the individual. Also because most Gen AIs as of now, they give honest answers, right? No companies can buy them. There's not advertisement as of yet in how they answer. So you can actually trust the answer. Of course, it do make mistakes, but I mean, it's getting better and better. But I think that's a real advantage that that it's much more rational than a human being could ever be, right? And another advantage is that when you use an AI to make the decisions for you, you're basically tapping into a resource that rich people have always had for hundreds and thousands of years. Namely, that they hire some expert, right? They have a chef, right? They have an architect, they have a financial advisor, right? They've always had that. And there's a huge advantage if they make something that you don't like, if they make a dish you don't like, if they make a financial decisions you don't like, you can blame them instead of yourself, right? You're outsourcing the burden of responsibility, right? And that's the same with a Gen AI. You can also, of course, ask it for advice advice on single stocks, right? And what should I buy now, and which AI stock should I buy, or whatever it could be. And then at least you have the advantage that even if you lose money on this advice, you can blame the AI instead of yourself. I think that's huge in terms of the paradox of freedom, right? The paradox of freedom is that the more freedom you have, the more responsibility and the more risk of regret, right? Because you can only ever blame yourself. So there's some relief of that burden when using AI, when outsourcing your decision making to AI. So I see a huge advantage to that. I mean, some cons to that is, of course, that if the AI, makes a very good decision for you that really benefits you, then you don't have the pleasure of feeling fully responsible for that decision, right? So there is sort of a dark side to it in terms of if you want to increase well-being. But I think the bright side far outweighs the dark side because it is so much more rational than a human being could ever dream to be, right? And it's getting better and better. The problem is, of course, that we should just take the advice, especially the advice on just putting it in a boring index, the ETF.
Understood. So you're saying if you use it right, and also the
Yeah.
more I think explainable AI, right? So how it makes decisions becomes more transparent. You'll be able to take advantage of it to benefit you. You
Yes.
mentioned also something very interesting that has to do with the paradox of rich people or successful people that have so much access to these elite advisors. However, also doing this extravagant spending, right? That irrational behavior, right? They still have to go through some of these challenges of poor money management. They have to understand their emotions to avoid luxury addiction, lifestyle inflation, right? So, because then you have more money and you have, as you said, more loss aversion.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, that's part of the curse of then being rich, right? But I must say something, just a little comment on this thing about extravagant spending. Some research also actually by Daniel Kahneman has suggested that the way we remember things, right, it's called the peak end rule. The way we remember an event is by the emotional peak throughout this event and then the end of the event. That's why it's called peak end rule. So the idea is it's just because there can be some rationality from a well-being perspective to actually do something extravagant, right? So instead of taking 1 or 2 weeks at Mallorca as some boring hotel, then just take 1 weekend at a very, very fancy hotel. Because the idea is that the way you remember it afterwards, you don't remember it the time sort of dilutes. It doesn't really matter that it's 2 weeks. But doing something extraordinary and extravagant can be an investment in your future self in the way that you remember it. It's just a much more positive memory when you look back on it. So it's just to say that there are some, you can easily rationalize extravagant behavior or extraordinary because it's so different from your everyday life that you remember it so fondly, right? And the rest of your life is so much longer than just those few days or few weeks that you spent on vacation. So it's just to say that there is some idea. It's not only bad to do extravagant spending.
I really like that approach of not only looking at, profit or loss, but the well-being. So, point taken, very, very interesting. Talk to me a little bit about shopping therapy. So, what's actually happening in our brains
when we do shopping?
Yes.
I mean, usually it starts with some stimuli that triggers our attraction in a way to do some buying, right? We either see some advertisement online or out in the streets that triggers our urge to go and buy this product or service, right? And of course, that's when the biggest sort of dopamine spike usually kicks in. It's when we predict that now something good is happening to us, right? Soon we'll get something good. And then, of course, dopamine is not only involved in pleasure, it's also involved in motivation, right? That's why you see kids running around and learn things so much. Well, they have much higher baseline dopamine levels. That's why they're so motivated to go out and play and learn languages so quickly and so on. They have just extremely high dopamine levels. But us as adults, it lowers with age, unfortunately. So we get this spike in dopamine when we predict that soon something good is going to happen to us, right? And that's what drives us from the initial sort of stimuli of this product we want to buy, right? Drives us to go buy it either online or in real life.
So, could it be a dangerous habit, or can we reframe it into something that can be constructive?
Yes, I mean, it can be both. Alcoholic some people become addicted to shopping. That's, of course, a very bad thing. They borrow money to buy more. That's obviously an addictive behavior that is detrimental to well-being, like taking a drug. But there's certainly also positive elements, like giving yourself a treat, right? Feeling that you deserve something good, like going to this extravagant restaurant or taking this extravagant vacation once in a while. There's certainly some positive, or it can be some positive aspects to that way, thinking that you deserve something good, right? You deserve something special, right? They can build sort of self-worth and self-confidence, right? Like buying nice clothing, right? Getting a tailor-made suit, right? It feels good with a tailor-made suit and a tailor-made shirt. That can certainly be, I would say, that can certainly be a good investment in the long run. So it's a little bit complicated when you talk about shopping, right? Because it can both be detrimental, really, really bad, and it could also be really, really good. Also because there's always some, I mean, when you buy clothing or a car or a watch or whatever, there's also this hope built into this shopping experience, right? There's this hope that people will like me better, or, I'll increase my status, or there's some hope I'll become a better person, right? That there's some hope built into this, which I think is quite life affirming in a way, right? Because of course, I mean, why do we want to be alive tomorrow? It's because we have some hope, right? Is it hope that gets us out of bed in the morning in a way, right? So I like that part, that there is definitely some positive aspects to some kinds of shopping.
And what about what we experience every day when you know you've overpaid for something? Usually you feel a little bit bad, right? Is that the loss aversion that you discussed? And when we know we got a very good deal for our money, we feel so happy. I'm so clever, right? I got the right deal. Is that the same what we discussed before?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I mean, that's of course why, again, our brain tricks us, right? When something is on sale, right? Black Friday, all of these events. I mean, they know us so well, like the shopping sort of industry, and the feeling that when we buy something on Black Friday, the feeling that if we don't buy it, we're actually losing, right? So again, exactly as you indicated, loss aversion kicks in, but now we focus on how much we're saving instead of how much we're spending, right? And also we forget this completely sort of primitive sort of standard economics that goods, they don't have any intrinsic value, right?
Yeah.
The value derives from how much people want to pay for it.
Yes.
So the fact is that we see something on sale, right? Before it was 1,000 euros, now it's 500 euros. Well, that 1,000 euros is just taken out of the blue, right? I mean, has nothing to do with its value, because if nobody wants to pay those thousand euros, it's not worth 1,000 euros. Just basic sort of market economics, right? So, but our brain just doesn't know this. We look at that before price and we think, I don't want to lose that saving, that difference between the before price and what we can pay now. Yeah, that that's why it ends up almost everything always being on sale, right? Some kind of sale, some kind of offer or something, right? Because now it feels like a loss if we have to pay full price, right? Or whatever that means. Because again, the price is only determined what people will pay for it.
I'd love to summarize some of this as a blueprint, but before I do that, just one question about teaching these concepts and how to control emotions from a young age to new generations. Do you see also the role of financial education at an early age being important in shaping disciplined money decisions?
Yes, definitely. I mean, children and young people, they have to learn about money and saving behavior. I think that's very important that children are being taught this. But I think often they have an intuitive sense. They learn very quickly from a very young age that money has value, right? You can buy candy, you can buy toys for money. But I mean, of course, we have this good old marshmallow experiment, right? Where children, because it's so old that you can sort of follow the consequences later on in life, where children are giving this option. Either you can have this marshmallow, this piece of candy now, but if you can wait 15 minutes, you'll get two, right? And those children that had the self-control of not eating that marshmallow, even though is very tasty and they really want it, and that they have that self-control to wait to get two after 15 minutes, that correlates with sort of everything good later on in their life, their lifetime income, education, marriages, and so on. So it seems that it's a good idea to give children that sort of self-control, that the benefit of saving something for later, right? That this one marshmallow becomes two, which very much correlates with buying that ETF, right? That will also only grow over time. I think that's very important. There's one little thing in terms of this marshmallow experiment and children. overall is that there's an alternative interpretation of why some children have the self-control, so-called self-control, to wait for the two marshmallows. And it is that they grew up in a family where they could actually trust the adults.
Okay.
Right? So imagine you're a child, you don't trust adults, right? So can you actually trust that they'll give you two marshmallows after 15 minutes? Because of course, if you don't trust them, you just is in a way rational to just take the one marshmallow, right? Because you haven't experienced trust. It's just a little detail in terms of that how you interpret experiments. Of course, you can often interpret them alternatively, because it makes sense. If you grow up with a family where you can trust the adults, you'll probably become a trusting adult yourself. And that will correlate with everything good in life, right? Trust.
Okay, yes, that's very interesting. Actually, I never thought about this way. But definitely, the environment where we grow up affects the way we make decisions. Right, that's obvious. Moving to the second and final part of today's discussion, I want to summarize some of these concepts that we discussed. Maybe a step-by-step, simple action plan for people to take a little bit of action from what we discussed today. I'll just mention what I correct me or add. I would see the first aspect as revaluing money. You mentioned how you can take these small emotional expenses that maybe we have written off as zero and put them into something that can be productive, investing, etc., that can grow potentially, but also tracking these emotional moments. So how often do we do that irrational spending, or how do we feel? You mentioned how wellness is tied up into. Would you see that as a starting point?
Yes, I think that's a very good starting point to do that.
And then we mentioned the importance of having your own investment thesis, a playbook, right? That you know your goals, you know your exit strategy as well, right? So what are you looking after, right? So you're not influenced that much about from the ups and downs of volatility.
Especially if you're investing in single stocks, obviously. Yeah, it becomes very boring with the index ETFs, right? Because it is not really relevant with the stop loss thing and so on. But that becomes highly relevant when you do single stocks. Of course, have a plan, right? It's difficult to curtail those emotions. Our brain is not built for especially this single stock investments. And so we really have to be in control and be very careful about making a plan, write it down, and then follow through, stop loss orders, and so on.
So it's about redesigning that environment and protecting it against the distractions that come from financial news notifications, etc., but also making these decisions at a state where our brain is vulnerable, right? We have to wait until our brain is calmer and we can make more logical decisions with friction, with time delay.
Yes, certainly.
And also there is boring, right? Boring automated systems, right? That potentially can build wealth versus that, signal we all have today, get rich fast. And you see that happening all the time around you, right? The big opportunities now, it's the AI bubble, or it's a crypto bubble, or it's stable coins, or it's something else.
Yes, certainly. Very much aware of this. It more often than not, it doesn't pay off.
And finally, we discussed about the role of AI. I think that's a very interesting topic, especially as AI becomes more prominent in life. And we see that it's not only happening from a personal standpoint. Banks, commercial institutions, everybody now is getting more intelligent in leveraging technologies um, to make predictive analytics better, etc. And the last part I would say is what you mentioned before on reflection, how that ties up to your well-being, not tying up that net worth into your identity, right? Because it can be dangerous at some points. And having that patience that is so important in life today. Everything is so fast and easy to get, right? Would that be a good summary for what we discussed today in terms of what people could do?
Certainly, I think you nailed it. I mean, and I think if there's one thing we could sort of do immediately, it would be to delete those apps on the phone. And remember, we can always reinstall them, right? But I think a good challenge would just be take 1 week without those apps on the phone, without checking financial news, without doing anything about your investments, and just see what happens after a week. And I think most people would experience it probably went pretty well. right? And think about all those costs that you're not making. Really, I think the concept of transaction costs is very important to keep in mind, right? That it's the bank that's making money. They want to do everything they can
Hmm.
to make you make more transactions, right? And remember the time you spend on it and the emotions uh, that you also spend on it. And remember, you could do so many other productive things with your time, making a podcast like you, or writing a book, or building some new product, or I mean, there's so many things you can do in life that is much more worthwhile to do.
Like, do you have a ritual of staying disciplined, or do you use these principles or other principles that you might find useful?
I think not acting on my impulsive investment decisions the same day. I mean,
Mhm.
taking them, as we talked about, taking at least, good nights of sleep before making decisions, and always make decisions when you're sort of rested and well fed, and sort of, yeah, you've just been eating, you're not hungry. It's as in general, not only investment decisions, but any kind of important decision. It's just better to take it when you're sort of when you feel good about yourself and you're
Mhm.
calm, right? And I think, yeah, I think that's probably my best advice and what I try to follow myself.
And if someone wants to read or wants to read your book or wants to go deeper in your research, can you tell me where they can find you? I'll also put that in the show notes.
Sure. I mean, there's they can look at my website Jon Wegener .dk, and you can find more information there. Also about the book, but as I mentioned, the book is so far it's just in Danish.
Any
But I'm writing
plans?
a new book, so
Okay.
so I think I'm writing a new book on sexual differences. I think they're endlessly fascinating.
Would you like to share a little bit because I also find this interesting, right?
I know we are one species, and the Homo sapiens, but men and women are so different. And think it's great. I mean, I like this way to think about it, is that sexual differences are 1.2 billion years old,
Mhm.
right? So sexual differences existed way before humans, our species existed. So to think about how different we really are, how differences in reproductive strategies also lead to how we had differences in risk taking, differences in how we treat hierarchies, differences in how we compete within our sexes, right? I mean, intrasexual competition among males is pretty primitive. Intrasexual competition among women, wow, that's very sophisticated. A lot of indirect aggression, or a lot of subtleties that we men usually don't notice at all. Women have their entirely different sort of system of competing against each other without men even noticing that, even though it's happening right in front of them. So if you go to a dinner party with your wife and there are other women present, they communicate on a completely different level where we don't notice it at all. So I think that for me, I think it's endlessly fascinating, the sexual differences between men and women, and also how the brains not only look different, but actually more prominently, they function very differently. Women have much more communication between the two hemispheres, and men have much better communication between front and back hemispheres. So men are much better at very focused, goal-directed behavior, while women are much better at sort of detecting emotions and intricacies of tone of voice, and they're much better at reading emotions from faces and so on. And that partly comes from the better communication between the two hemispheres. So I just find it endlessly fascinating. And especially now, I mean, Denmark is part of the EU. We have this crazy new law. It's called the gender balance law, where there's
Mhm.
supposed to be close to 50-50 men and women in boardrooms in the biggest
Yes.
companies.
Mhm.
And of course, I mean, how insane is that? And so, of course, I'm also interested in, from a scientific standpoint, to debunk or to point out that how detrimental it is to make such law, because where you mandate that we have to discriminate
Yes.
between the sexes, and how it actually, in the end, we want to help women by making these laws, but of course, obviously, it's the women we hurt the most. In the end, they're being completely devalued, and it will take maybe decades to, even though we remove that law, it will probably take decades to make up for it. So I think, yeah, sex differences is one of the the aspects of human behavior I've been most consistently fascinated by, but not only in investment decisions, certainly
Right.
also there, but in every aspects of life.
That's fascinating. And as you said, it's a fine balance, inclusion and diversity. Not everybody gets it right. I'm very interested in what you're going to write next. Before we finish, any other thoughts you want the listeners to take away?
No, actually not. I think we pretty much got around. And thank you very much for some very good questions. A very good discussion.
Thank you so much. And Jon, thanks so much for rewiring our brains today. And to our listeners, thank you so much for listening, and I'll catch you in the next episode. Thank you.